Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, or morning, wherever you're joining us from. And welcome to the plenary session on carbon services and market opportunities through conservation agriculture. We have a great lineup with 4 speakers here this afternoon. And we're going to start off the first presentation here with Dr. Brian McConkey. Brian is a lead scientist with Varesco Solutions. Before that, he was the lead carbon scientist, or one of the lead carbon scientists for Canada in the National Agriculture Ministry Research Branch, and responsible for looking at carbon inventory procedures for the IPCC inventory, as well as for protocols and other purposes. Brian also has a background in CA research and cropping systems research. So welcome, Brian, and you can start off with us on counting carbon.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me here. Just gotta find that. Buttons. Okay. So yeah, so I was asked to just give a brief talk about one of the issues around counting carbon. Of course, it's become very important now. And I can't see the slides, so guess maybe could someone tell me where am I at on the slides? Are they visible, or?
You're at the outline, Brian.
Outline. Okay. Okay, I can just follow on my own then. Okay, so I guess the key questions is why count the soil organic carbon? Some of the issues around just estimating at a point, then how do we estimate over an area, then how do we estimate soil organic carbon change, and then sort of some of the bigger questions, I guess, in terms of counting, and then, is there sort of a path forward and a brief summary. So, why count carbon? I guess obviously soil organic matter, which of course is really what we're really talking about. I guess when we're talking about soil organic carbon, there's many functions, and so there's many reasons why we want to know how much carbon we have, how much soil organic matter we have in the soil. So supporting soil health, diversity of organisms, nutrient cycling, buffering of nutrients, carbon exchange, very, very important role in soil structure and water storage, the movement and partitioning of the water, the decomposition of organic contaminants, but certainly probably the biggest one that's come up now is issues around just carbon sequestration. And then of course, with that, obviously, that is actually getting down to the nitty-gritty where the counting carbon really becomes much more of a under much more scrutiny, I guess, is when you get greenhouse gas offsets that include soil organic carbon change. So I think one thing we have to always remember is that the carbon sequestration is from the soil organic carbon change, not from the stock. So the stocks is the amount of carbon you have. As I said, that's really important. But when it comes down to carbon sequestration or the offsets, it's really about the change. And so really the stocks itself don't tell you anything about what's going to happen to them directly. And so, and this is, of course, really our problem then is that we really have to measure this and have to have it quantify the soil organic carbon change, which is really small relative to stocks. So it's difficult to accurately estimate that real change. So, the first part, then I'll just talk about how do we estimate soil organic carbon at a point. So we have direct measurements of soil organic carbon, what I call direct measurements. I'll go into that. Then measurement using different proxies for soil organic carbon concentration and bulk density, and then soil organic carbon from process models. And then other things that we do need to remember when we're talking about soil organic carbon and counting it is that, of course, we also have a large amount of soil inorganic carbon. Now it's less dynamic, but it still is somewhat dynamic, and so this can be a very important part of the carbon in the soil. So we really have to make a decision as to whether we're counting total carbon, which would include soil inorganic and organic carbon, or whether we're only interested in the organic carbon. Usually, it's only the organic carbon. So, so I think that is something. And the other thing is, of course, this really is the depth. Like, how deep do you want to go? So certainly. The standard, I guess, now is more or less 30 centimeters that anything less than that is considered problematic because it could be rearrangement and movement of the carbon with depth. So you may not, measuring just at the very surface may give you a distorted view of sort of the soil organic carbon change or stocks in the larger part of the profile. So some authors say we should go deeper to 60 centimeters. Some want to go to 100. Some even want to go deeper than that. But however, the deeper you go, then the more variability you have, and so the more difficult it is to detect a real change. So the first thing is what I call, direct measurements of soil organic carbon, and this is, really the standard for this. Then is you measure the soil organic carbon concentration, you measure the soil bulk density and the soil depth to at least 30 centimeters, and then you essentially multiply those together, and that gives you the stock at one time. And typically this is the lab standard now for soil organic carbon concentrations, direct measurement of soil organic carbon from dry combustion with an analyzer for carbon, and the bulk density, at least for agricultural soils, from soil core, and then and these of course make a basic point measurement. This is really, I guess, what we consider direct measurement. And so, but we can also have many proxies that we might be using to estimate soil organic carbon at a point. And certainly the most commonly used one is that you have a laboratory or portable visible near infrared spectroscopy equipment that to estimate soil organic carbon concentration from the soil samples. And then, but you still then would need somehow other means to continue to measure the soil bulk density and depth. And then, but importantly, those it is just essentially the spectroscopy is really just a model of the soil organic carbon based on the reflectance, and so you have to make sure that those estimates of concentration with visible near infrared are calibrated and validated with the traditional direct soil organic carbon measurements. Remote sensing can also estimate the surface soil organic carbon using some of those same wave bands and infrared and visible spectrums, and where at least where the soil is visible, and then of course there's many anything that can fly, I guess, or can be in space can do that. However, obviously to go to 30 centimeters, to go deeper, then you'd have to again have a relationship with the sort of direct measurements of soil organic carbon. And other methods are under development, whether it's laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy or inelastic neutron scattering, but they're not widely used yet. So for bulk density, then that's often in some cases the bigger problem. We don't have as much capacity, I guess, to estimate that. So it still depends a lot on the actual measurements. However, there's a lot of what's called pedal transfer functions, relationships between soil properties such as texture and soil organic carbon, and measured bulk density. Then you use those simply to estimate. Others would be gamma ray attenuation. Some pedal transfer function models might be able to incorporate soil penetration resistance and soil moisture content. So there's other things then that can also be used as proxies. And then finally we get to process models, which again can estimate. In fact, they really are estimating really at a point or peon scale, and so they also are capturing the soil processes of decomposition and stabilization that affect the inputs of organic matter of the soil. So by capturing these processes, then it can estimate the current soil organic stocks. And however, existing models, although some can certainly, or at least are designed or have been coded, I guess, in a way that they can estimate soil organic change below 30 centimeters. That's really as not as well established yet. So now then we go to how do we estimate over an area, and And so, that's usually what we want. We don't really want to know just at a point. We want to know over an area. So the traditional method has been to, stratify the area into individual stratum or strata that are assumed to be homogeneous regarding soil organic carbon stocks. So you take a landscape and divide it into areas that you think would, or not think, but you based on lots of information that you believe would be homogeneous. And so, the basis then of stratification is you're looking for those conditions that present and past that would give it the same stocks at the present time. So you look at soil forming factors of weather, landform, drainage, types and amount of vegetation, so parent material, and also land use and management. So past land use and timing. When was it in forest? When was it not? How long has it been cropland? Types and amounts of crops. And you'd also include things like weeds and cover crops and other organic soil amendments, soil disturbing erosion. And then there are also many what we call covariates that can be related more easily. That we can have that are easier in a sense to measure, but then we can relate to soil organic carbon, and that gives us a greater power than to stratify. So digital elevation models at the landform, variation, vegetation growth, and so that can tell us a lot about underlying conditions, electromagnetic induction, field and paddock boundaries, of course, are important because, again, land use change are important determinants of soil organic carbon. Soil moisture, again, can help us understand sort of the nature of the soil, the conditions that affect decomposition and inputs, and then we may have a lot of what we might call legacy geospatial data in terms of soils, parent materials that have been sort of mapped out for us already. So there's lots of things. So as I said, we can use these covariates. So I've already talked about these. And so these things, we have more detailed measurements than we have of soil organic carbon, so it becomes very effective way of stratification. And then in some cases, we really, if we have enough covariates, then we may not really actually have to do, do the stratification, because we may just be able to use them directly, in a sense, allow them to almost form their own continuous model, I guess, in a sense, of what the soil organic carbon is. Again, it all has to be based on some direct measurements to establish the relationship, but it can be used. Except for just the only thing to be concerned about is always remember, because if we're looking forward in terms of change in soil organic carbon, then we really want to capture the management and go forward, and those are usually around field and paddock boundaries. So you don't want to sort of ignore those. And so, estimating soil organic carbon change is really, again, just estimating soil organic carbon stock at two different times. So that's, I guess, in some ways sounds pretty simple. But that would be how it would be done with measurements. But we can also have, if we have a lot of empirical measurements of change itself, we can establish what's called factors, soil organic carbon change. And that's used, for example, with the IPCC default equations. Or we can actually estimate continual soil organic carbon change from process models. I guess I could mention too, we could have CO2 fluxes from the soil surface, but I'm not going to cover that. So I should maybe just check. Am I on slide 15 on the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the factors then is where you might have a lot of estimates from a lot of long-term experiments, and so you can actually establish that you can see a change in carbon, and then you can have you can say there's a factor. So for example, it might be half a ton of carbon per year, change in no-till based on direct measurements, and and then you could use that factor of change, directly. So in that case, you really only have to make sure that the experiments cover the range of conditions which the factors are applied, and require the actual practice change to be similar, essentially the same as like what occurred in the experiment. And then the process model is certainly, a very effective way of estimating the change. Many do not trust the solid organic carbon model, but as long as the models are properly calibrated and initialized, then they can be shown to work well. But importantly, then it has to make sure that they are continually, validated. They have made good estimates against the real world measurements, range of conditions, which is going to be applied. And so the only well-validated model. So as long as they're well-validated, I don't, the concern about the process model, but certainly just applying the process model without going through these steps, and particularly maybe only just calibrating and not validating with a separate set of data that can be problematic. And then models themselves may also use a lot of the covariates based methods, so biomass input and soil moisture and other things that may come from some of the covariates I mentioned for stratification. So you also would probably want to stratify in terms of doing process models, which may also use some of those covariates as inputs as well. So, the big question then really in this counting carbon is, what is the required accuracy, or maybe we can, flip it around really, because it's really more, usually the question is, what is the required, or what is the need to have, how much uncertainty, I guess, in a sense, is allowed. And, because of that, you have many, because it's not well established, and certainly different protocols, different methodologies. Some don't even really include it. Some do, but it means, what's happened was it's led to a lot of claims that, I can easily measure your solid organic carbon, so why bother modeling, or why do all that other work when we can just measure it? But in reality, can they measure it with, it really depends. The question to ask then is, what is the accuracy they need? And then it becomes much more difficult. Every proxy estimate, every approximation adds uncertainty. So again, if the direct soil carbon measurement is still considered, I guess, our closest to the truth, except for it's only, of course, covers one point, and we're usually interested in the area. The reality, measuring, these expected solid organic carbon changes over 1 to 5 years, which might be the kind of time span we're interested in, are typically similar to sort of the uncertainty of measurement. So it's really, really challenging to estimate this in reality. But also, again, a lot of people just ignore soil bulk density because it's really kind of it can be quite labor intensive to measure, and it doesn't lend itself as well to being alternate means of measuring it as exists with soil organic carbon concentration. And so, you tend to see a lot of methods just kind of ignore soil bulk density because it is difficult, but it can change in time. And because you look at such small changes, that can easily overwhelm the actual changes in soil organic carbon. And so it's become quite standard now to have to express on mass equivalent basis, which means you're doing it for the same mass of soil, the change of that mass of soil over time to remove some of the impacts of the temporal changes in bulk density. But that then means you need accurate soil bulk density to do that. You really can't do that with, say, Pareto transfer function models or something, which would be more time invariant. So this challenge of uncertainty really comes to fore when you start considering soil bulk density. Certainly, the academic criteria of discerning the change would be that you could say that's different from what would occur by chance alone. Is really not feasible for offsets. It's just simply too costly to measure to that kind of a standard. And so you see all kinds of other ways in the protocols of trying to provide some sort of deduction or something around uncertainty. But again, this whole thing is very not yet well established, and so it really creates a problem, and it's really difficult to compare protocols or methodologies without understanding what is the uncertainty of them and also what needs to be included in the uncertainty. And so often you see, sort of arbitrary deduction offsets and deduction based more on feasibility rather than necessarily on the science. But one thing we do see is that just because of the averaging of errors, we do see that the estimates for large areas to be more relative accuracy than for small areas. And okay, so now the path forward, the offsets are complicated by by all by this requirement that all the offsets require you to have this counterfactual or sort of hypothetical business as usual condition. So it's not really measurable, or at least I would say measurable in a way that could be shown to be have a high level of integrity. So it's certainly makes that easier to estimate with a process model. So this is starting to lead us to the point as models improve and if they're supported by and continually validated by strategic high quality measurements, that may be the best approach going forward. They certainly, unlike some of these empirical relationships you might have with covariates, these are based on really the processes as far as we understand them, and so that means that they these, and they're shown to be more consistent, moving across space or across time than say sort of empirical relationships you might have with different covariates that I mentioned earlier under stratification. And there's no reason it can't be as accurate as any other method. There's no no particular reason why measurements itself could be necessarily more accurate. Again, it's always, like I say, it's important that the models, I think, have to be supported and continually validated, though. And models continue improving, and once you build a model-based system, you can swap in and include improved models, whereas measurements are more locked into time since you can't improve on the past. So whatever you started with a measurement, you can't really improve that. If it didn't turn out to be very effective, and then you're sort of giving up that early measurements as you may improve the system later. And also a key advantage of models, of course, you can estimate future change, and this is future change under changing conditions too. And so that is huge value since measurement-based systems are really looking in the rearview mirror, and allows focused limited measuring resources so that they satisfy the model calibration and validation needs, but that can reduce your overall cost. And again, I think the harmonization of uncertainty estimation and certainty requirements will enable the comparison of the stock estimates and to produce comparable offsets based on organic carbon change. So this part needs to be sorted out as part of the path forward. It's separate really from necessarily having to have models, but I think to otherwise you've got this complex set of methodologies, and which one is better, which one should I use, which one should I invest in, is not clear. So hopefully I'm on the summary slide. Anyways, and so direct measurements involve measuring bulk density, so organic carbon concentration from dry combustion element of the analyzer, and all done to a certain depth. And that underpins all the other methods, no matter what other method it is, whether it's modeling, whether it's near infrared, spectroscopy, or whatever. They're all at one point or the other have to depend on those few key measurements that are made. So this is again the essentially the foundation of all our methodologies, and it can be used itself as the main measure with appropriate number of samples in a stratified system. And there's certainly many ways that we can estimate beyond sort of this direct measurement. Process, I think, appears to be the most suitable for offset systems. And again, I think the counterfactual baseline is probably the key reason that is. Otherwise you have to make all kinds of heroic assumptions about organic carbon staying constant in the baseline, or other assumptions that are hard to show. that in fact they would be true. So so it certainly a sense probably the most efficient in terms of cost as well. At least to meet a certain uncertainty standard where you want to have it backed by a number of really high quality, a strategic set of high quality measurements. And then again, there's definitely a need to come to an agreement about the uncertainty, and that's the main thing. So with that, then thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That will lead us into our next speaker, Karen Haugen-Kozyra, talking about packaging emission reductions. Karen is the president of Resco Solutions, a network of leading advisors making sustainability real for clients in the agriculture, bioenergy, and sustainable food sectors across North America and globally. Karen has many years of experience in agriculture greenhouse gas measurement and modeling and climate change environmental policy development, especially in protocol developments, both for government and for industry. She's working with a couple of like Bayer that we heard from yesterday, Nutrien, fertilizer manufacturings, and others. So Karen, I give the mic to you, or the clicker to you, and learn about packaging emission reductions.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you guys this afternoon, or wherever you are around the world, or whatever time frame. Very pleased to be here. So my topic that Tom has assigned for me is packaging emission reductions. And we have been spending, Brian, myself, and probably 25 years of my life working on monetizing carbon for market needs. Some of our clients and partners, as Tom indicated, we work with NGOs, the standard body themselves, large corporations, small companies, governments, a lot in Canada and North America for sure. And so I wanted to talk about, and this always isn't well understood, that when we're packaging anything, we have to follow particular standards, accounting standards, and they're different accounting standards for different purposes. The one at the bottom, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is basically looking at the baseline and then the project activity, or if you're talking about scope 3, what is the intervention that a corporate is doing in its supply chain, usually on farm upstream? And so we have other types of tools that are, calculators to look at what if. Oftentimes these get embedded in methodologies, as Brian had talked about. We've got the status of inventories, right? The footprint, if you will, of a corporate or a country's inventory. And then the LCA analysis, specifically if you're looking at greenhouse gases with 1404, 14,040, or the product level one, 14,067, which is how green. But really, when we're talking about what's changed, it's this one. This is the market appropriate accounting standards set. So where do I come from? I come from Alberta, where Tom is. And if you look back down the road today of where carbon pricing has gone, and I don't know why the countries aren't showing on here, but you could see Switzerland in 1990 was dabbling with putting a price on carbon. And then we fast forward, oh my goodness. The green dot there is actually in Alberta in Canada. So in 2007, we brought in a carbon pricing system, the most comprehensive one in North America at the time. The EU ETS was going strong. And then we fast forward to 2013, and I'm so sorry that the countries aren't showing up, but when they're colored, you can tell what they are. In 2013, we saw many more countries putting price on carbon, either through a tax or a trading system. And then when you fast forward to today, we have over 60 countries that have put at a national or subnational level some form of putting a price on carbon, signaling to the economy that carbon has a price and it is not free to emit, which opens up the opportunity for offsets and markets. And so we also have overlaid on all of this compliance-based markets, the voluntary carbon market. So the Climate Action Reserve, US, Mexico, and Canada, the VERA, Voluntary Carbon Standard, or Verified Carbon Standard, global, American Carbon Registry, global, and the Gold Standard, global. So we've got several different types of markets operating, compliance markets and voluntary markets. So as we look at that landscape, there are many opportunities for conservation agriculture to engage. The ones that are set up by governments that we were just looking at, the ones that are set up by a standard or registry in a voluntary carbon market, and then the one that's emerging here is the corporate level in setting scope 3 actions. So when corporates do their carbon footprint according to WRI-GHG protocol and calculate their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, if you're a food and beverage company, you're seeing about 70% of your impact upstream on the farm. If you are a nutrient or a Yara, you're seeing 70% of the impact downstream in your category 11, which is use of products sold. So this is a big, huge driver, as Tom had mentioned, and Debbie will go into more discussion of these markets. But I think the way the civil societies look at the potential for scope 3 emissions, and I think everybody probably saw a few weeks ago in The Hague, the ruling by the courts that Shell would need to address their downstream scope 3 emissions, it is huge. It's a huge untapped potential for reducing emissions. So we've been spending a lot of time in the scope 3, and I know Debbie has too. But if we look at Alberta, we've got now 14 years of experience under our belt. And we were a series of firsts. As I said, in 2007, we had a economy-wide carbon pricing system with offsets. We based everything on the ISO 14064 standards, which were fresh. They were 2006 when they were published. And then we have now, today, 21 offset protocols, 7 for agriculture, 9 in total for natural climate solutions-based protocols. Now I think this is dated, there's probably over 350 projects registered. We've been approving ground for other systems across our country and others. And we have been the only jurisdiction that has been able to develop offsets at scale from agriculture. So over 17 million active Alberta soil carbon compliance offsets have been generated. And Brian and I worked hard back in the day on getting the conservation cropping protocol developed. We have shown that we have monitoring, reporting, and verification systems that scale, and assurance systems that work for land-based sectors. And really, to demonstrate soil carbon at scale, we didn't overthink aggregation. You got small numbers of properties that are being aggregated together, quantified, reported on, and verified. Just as an example, here's one of the largest soil organic carbon projects on Earth. One of our aggregators, this is our little province, Alberta. Now you can see it in this 100 farms that this particular company is calculating and monitoring, reporting, and having verified every year. Building protocols, I think you got the sense from Brian that this is not, it's a very intense process. And so you look at the different types of management practices, we call these BMPs, beneficial management practices. How robust is the science associated with these types of, no-till or covering about? And then you have to put them through the key requirements of the marketplace. Uncertainty is one that's giving us a lot of grief right now, and I think Brian did a good job of covering it. And then you get a monetizable ecosystem service or a carbon offset. 1 ton of CO2e reduced or removed from the baseline, as Brian pointed out. And really, when you're packaging supply, whether you're talking about a traditional market, carbon market, or a scope 3 value change insetting program, the steps are all the same. We call them measuring, monitoring, reporting, verification is the packaging of these things. And so whether it's an offset or an inset, the steps are pretty much the same. And you need a protocol to be able to access, or a methodology to access this and package things. Now, challenges. So what I'm going to do is just quickly go through the voluntary standards. You could see here, you could study this. It's also in this link here. But really, my point here is agriculture, 0.2%. Next one, gold standard, agriculture, 0.2%. Next one, Vera, agriculture, 0.2%. Climate Action Reserve, California, 2%. Yay. Okay, they 10 times more. There are challenges, and a lot of these challenges arise because of the offset rules. And so they're pretty much coalesced across the different systems, but additionality is a very difficult one. You need to prove that you are not business as usual in your activities. They must be real and measurable, and I think Brian did a great job. And the uncertainty there is a real challenge. Verifiable, third parties just has to come along and be able to track. It's an accounting process. Data trails and evidence are really important. They must be permanent. And now the world is coalesced around 100 years. Try to talk to a farmer about a 100-year contract. Clearly owned, not double counted, and functional equivalence. Okay, we've got to be comparing the same metric, functional unit. You just can't get rid of a lot of animals and say, oh, yeah, we've reduced our emissions. No, you've reduced your animals. Leakage is another big one. Material misstatement verification. Usually it's a plus or minus 5% materiality threshold. Uncertainty, Brian covered that very well. And verifiable, as I mentioned before. So when we're talking about agricultural systems and conservation agriculture, there are a lot of challenges, as you can see, with the way markets are designed. And I'm sure Debbie and Katie will go into this in detail, but they're not metered. So when you're dealing with a regulator or a standards body, there's risk and cost, and the uncertainty is high. Sometimes you need to hit a bar of 95% confidence interval with no more than 15% variability of the estimate, as Brian had said. And when you're dealing with biological systems, that's a challenge. Again, we do try to rely on model and estimates, but the uncertainty. And then the fact that you've got small packets of carbon reductions or removals that you need to package together to attract a buyer. Soil sequestration, we already said 100 years, and the revenue stream for each farmer is small, so there's scale and cost. Activities can shift, and so leakage needs to be paid attention to. And then when you're talking to a farmer and you're trying to explain additionality, it becomes a very challenging thing. We're working with a standards body where they say, well, if it's more than 20% acceptance, then it's not additional. We're not going to allow it in our system. So that gives you, I think, a sense of packaging and the challenges. So there's two elements of data that you need to collect from the farm as well. So there's the activity data that you use to plug into the protocol or methodology and do your calculations and your accounting for greenhouse gases. But then in order to meet the assurance levels that a lot of these markets have is that proof of practice. And this can be a bigger challenge in some ways because you're going to have a third-party auditor come on the farm, the project developer, and then sample usually a number of farms just to ensure that that data trail is clear and accurate. We've been working very hard on these new soil carbon protocols. We've been on the working groups, and we're working with corporates to try to implement these ones. They were sponsored by Indigo, the Climate Action Reserve Soil Enrichment Protocol. It's broad in scope, and a lot of regen type of activities in there. And then the other one globally is VM42 on improved ag land management. There are challenges with these. They're very complex. It's a combination of modeling and measurement. And so people are trying to implement them, getting their heads wrapped around them, but they are going to be a challenge. And so from the view of the gold standard, we have a number of market challenges that we need to overcome. Never mind getting the measurement right. Right now, in terms of how the markets are working and pricing the offsets, the process can be slow. expensive, manual and paper-based. So we need to move it to, and with digital ag, we're demonstrating with pilots on the ground with our partners and our clients that digital ag and that technology is going to help immensely. But the supply is very limited. I think I demonstrated that. The demand is limited as well because of no real benchmarks on the quality. Buyers aren't sure what they're buying. And then when you move into the Scope 3 pricing, again, this is an emerging area. And there's limited supply chain, not for lack of effort. There's lots of corporates who are exploring the value change initiative. And I think Debbie will talk a little bit more about that. But again, also, there's a lack of consensus on how to calculate, track, transfer, and report greenhouse gas intensity. Hence, Gold Standard working on a value change guidance. So in summary, the demand, as Tom had mentioned, is high, and it will continue to increase. With the Mark Carney, Bill Winters task force, they want to increase the volume and supply by 15 times, at the same time tightening up the core carbon principles that they would like to put in place across. And there's a lot of people involved in these things. There's the international airlines, and of course the race to zero. That's driving a lot of demand and carbon neutrality for offsets as well. So it's not going away. We all have a challenge, I think, to do here. The key question is, and I think we need to explore it in the questions and answers, can conservation agriculture package enough supply? I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Karen. Very good and on time. Appreciate that. We thought things were complex with Brian's talk on measuring carbon, and so carbon varying in so many dimensions. And now in the protocols, we see that there's dimensions to protocols, both in the suppliers and the markets for them, and how we account the amount of paperwork and tracking and verification on protocols is a daunting task for many of them. It is disappointing that so few agriculture projects are on some of these markets. We're going to go next to Debbie Reed. Debbie is the executive director of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. It's a member-based organization launching ecosystem services markets for agriculture to recognize and reward farmers and ranchers. Debbie previously led the Coalition on the Agriculture Greenhouse Gases, which was a national multi-stakeholder coalition supporting development of tools, support systems, knowledge, and programs to improve the quantification of GHGs, or greenhouse gases, from agriculture. You may have seen some of their publications from the CAG was the acronym, and newsletters. So as we moved from carbon and when we talk about conservation agriculture, we see that there are many other things that are in being provided or supplied, these externalities or public goods from conservation agriculture. So, but we have a market for carbon. So do we stay on carbon or do we increase more of this? And Debbie will talk to us about that.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to Brian and Karen for their great presentations. I'll build on this, and I've been asked to specifically speak about supply demand and the state of play and growth projections. For this conversation, because we're talking about conservation agriculture, and because all of my work focuses on agriculture, I will focus solely on agriculture as the source of supply. But I will talk about demand drivers in markets from the perspective of all of the opportunities that agricultural supply can meet. And as Karen mentioned, we can operate in compliance markets, there are voluntary markets, and there are new markets and demand drivers that are really driving demand right now. And then I'll talk a little bit about the state of play and growth projections for the area. I wanted to start, though, by talking about ESMC. We're our national scale ecosystem service market program dedicated exclusively to agriculture. As Karen talked about a lot of the challenges, we have built and designed a market specifically to overcome a lot of the challenges that exist in markets right now. and to focus not just on carbon and greenhouse gases, but all of the benefits that agriculture can bring to bear. And this really does get to the issue of additional demand and additional desire from consumers and corporates and others for benefits above and beyond just soil carbon and greenhouse gases from agriculture. But our mission as an organization is to really utilize market mechanisms to meet the demand that we see on the horizon. We are a member-based organization. We're a nonprofit. And this slide shows our members. And the important point to make here is that we are a public-private partnership working in a pre-competitive space to really launch a program that meets everyone's needs. So as you see here, we have large corporates who are buyers. We have all the major agricultural groups in the United States who are the suppliers. And then we have companies in the middle who play various roles in delivering our end-to-end program for not just carbon offsets, but also, as Karen alluded to, most of the work that we do is in meeting supply chain opportunities for food and beverage sector, for whom agriculture is a large part of their environmental footprint. We also have environmental NGOs, land grant universities, research organizations, and everyone here is basically co-investing in pilot testing our program right now. So we have learned a lot about how to actually do this at scale, cost effectively, to overcome a lot of the issues that Brian and Karen were alluding to. When we talk about supply and demand, as I indicated, I will focus just on agriculture as a source of supply, but demand for carbon and ecosystem service credits is at unprecedented levels globally right now, and I will talk a little bit more about that. Karen mentioned some of those issues. There is huge interest in agricultural credits in particular, and that interest is also unprecedented. Soil carbon in particular has captured a lot of attention, and there's reasons for that I will go into. There's also consumer interest in the products that they purchase, and particularly products that we consume, right? Both food and beverages that we consume. And producers or consumers want to know, who produced this food or this beverage that I'm going to consume? How was it produced, right? And when you talk about agricultural products, food products, there actually is a great story to tell that comes along with it, because you can talk to the growers, right? So there's a huge interest in that. I would say the other reason that there's huge demand at in unprecedented levels is because climate change impacts are real, they are growing, and we are seeing those impacts both in the agricultural sector, which does business outdoors and is experiencing unprecedented levels of drought, of flooding, of severe weather impacts, right? So climate change impacts are real, they're growing, and they're very costly, not just to us as consumers, but to governments and to corporations. In referencing why supply from agriculture is in high demand, I spoke a little bit about that. Agricultural credits or impacts from agriculture are highly charismatic and impactful. There's a lot that you can point to, whether it's soil carbon, which improves soil tilth, fertility, productivity, improves water holding capacity, improves cation exchange capacity. There's a lot there that you can point to that has benefits above and beyond carbon benefits. So there's a lot of impact, but as I indicated, they're highly charismatic, not just because of the producers and the producer stories, but because of the stories around food and how it's grown. Supply from agriculture is also important because a lot of the practices and changes that reduce greenhouse gases and improve other impacts, environmental impacts from agriculture, actually make agricultural production systems more resilient. So by building soil carbon, by building organic matter, we are actually making those systems more resilient, more resistant, if you will, to erosion from wind, from high weather events, more likely to survive drought because improved healthy soils have greater resistance to drought due to their improved water holding capacity. So the benefits that we can get from agriculture also confer benefits and increase resilience to agriculture as a system. Also, I discussed some of the multiple benefits that agricultural emissions reductions can meet to meet consumer and societal demand. So carbon, greenhouse gas mitigation are obviously the highest priorities right now to reduce the impacts of climate change, but also we can quantify improved water quality, reduced water use. We do know that in many parts of the world, drought and other overuse of water is causing water issues, water demand issues. We can also point to biodiversity and wildlife habitat, particularly for like grazing land and grassland systems that are all benefits of improved environmental footprints from agriculture. And then I did reference, and I think Brian spoke well, to improve soil fertility, crop productivity, yield, water holding capacity from improved soil carbon benefits as well. One slide I did want to talk a little bit about the benefits of agriculture. A lot of folks refer to carbon and greenhouse gases as a benefit from agriculture, and then the other benefits as co-benefits. And I would urge us all to really understand that these other benefits, water quality, water availability, biodiversity, they are essential goods and services in their own right. And corporates, policymakers, governments are really all starting to understand that and to value those benefits independently and separately from carbon and greenhouse gases. And so I think we need to build our quantification systems, our market approaches to address that. And also engage in landscape and systems thinking and programs so that we are tracking not just carbon impacts of all of the changes we're making on the horizon, but building markets that changes to water quality, water use, biodiversity, so that we're making informed policy decisions and that producers can make informed decisions and know when in fact there might be trade-offs, or when in fact they can undertake practices that have symbiotic and multiple beneficial impacts. I think the other thing is because these are essential goods and services in their own right, and we do as a society rely on all of these, not just carbon, but water, biodiversity, we must pay for them. And that's the genesis and the very basis of markets, right, is supply and demand. So I hope I've established there is demand. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And as Karen indicated, we do need to focus on how we actually create the supply to meet the demand. Getting a little bit more into the issue of demand and compliance grade versus voluntary markets. The question I asked is demand from whom? And I think the answer is that states at many levels, right, subnational, at the national level, corporations, investors, banks, virtually every sector right now is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and starting to also demand improved water and biodiversity impacts. The genesis behind the carbon and greenhouse gas focus is we can point to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, in which both countries and increasingly corporations are in fact agreeing to limit global temperature increase no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and looking at their total greenhouse gas inventories as countries, as states, as cities, as corporations, and then figuring out how they individually can reduce their inventories to help meet that Paris Agreement commitment. So it's interesting because we started off with nations doing that inventory and setting targets. We now have corporations, we have cities, we have states, we have regions doing the same, all towards meeting greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. That is creating huge demand and demand signals. We also have, for the other benefits, the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, which look at not just carbon, but greenhouse gases, social issues, labor issues, land use issues, hygiene issues, right? These are all additional drivers that corporations are now striving to create commitments to help meet those UN Sustainable Development Goals, and countries are too. So again, we now have the public sector and the private sector doing the same sorts of things, taking on both compliance and voluntary obligations to do so. Every day, you're probably familiar, there are new net zero, carbon neutral, and other commitments that governments are setting, that companies are setting. And increasingly, they're expanding those commitments beyond carbon and greenhouse gases to water and biodiversity. And I won't review all of those, but I think that has become a new phenomena, and again, creating additional demand. In terms of the purpose, right? Karen spoke to this. There are compliance markets. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I will say what they do in the compliance markets is generate a legal or regulatory obligation to set a cap on the amount of carbon that can be emitted within a boundary, whether it's a national or a state boundary or a regional boundary. Or a corporate boundary, right? So there's a cap set. The cap declines over time to a point that is an agreed emission reduction, and that each year, everyone in that boundary, whether it's a nation or a state, understands what their goal and their obligation is to meet that declining cap, right? So what happens is generally a government or the region will say, this corporation has this amount of carbon to emit. They must do so within their own inventories. And sometimes there's an allowance to purchase offsets to help meet the emission reductions that they can achieve within their own facilities and footprints. That is what's creating demand for offsets. The ability to purchase emission reductions from another sector, another organization, another entity. Agriculture, again, is a high source of demand for those credits right now. Karen showed some of the examples of compliance markets at multiple scales, so I won't speak any further to that. She also showed voluntary markets and voluntary commitments, both public and private. Just like for compliance markets, there are both public and private actors operating in these markets. Corporations, as I indicated, have started to look at their own inventories and to take on commitments to meet global emission reduction agreements such as Paris, not only because their consumers, their shareholders, their stakeholders are pressuring them, but also because increasingly they see their economic viability at risk. Their ability to source ingredients and products, particularly from agriculture, is at risk. So a lot of these companies are working within their supply chains, particularly their agricultural supply chains, to reduce the risk within those supply chains and working with their producers. Also, we see banks, investors, and others committing not to provide finance to corporations or to others who haven't visibly taken on a commitment to reduce their footprint and to reduce it in a quantified fashion over time. So we're seeing material risk, we're seeing financial risk, we're seeing all of these come together to, again, back up the demand. So there are new legal requirements that we are seeing growing also in terms of a company's divulging their climate risk and divulging what they're doing. And that risk is now, again, translating into water risk globally, and a pending recognition that if we don't work to preserve biodiversity, to preserve natural resources, there could be a collapse. So we're seeing, again, the expansion from just carbon as a focus to other benefits and natural resource requirements. And because of that, we are seeing a willingness, not just from countries, but from corporates, to help to pay to reduce those commitments, including by purchasing credits. I just show this slide to say the way we have built our program, and I think you will see a lot more of this in the future for the reason I spoke to, is that a producer engages in a project and then we just stack the credits based on their entering data, so that we monetize this not just for carbon, but for all of the demand that we see on the horizon. I think the other thing to point out here is our market program. We designed it so that we can participate in voluntary carbon offset markets or compliance grade carbon offset markets and compliance water markets. Or separately, when a producer enrolls, they can enroll in projects that meet supply chain reporting. And as Karen indicated, the outcomes are the same. It's the differences in how we quantify and the amount of rigor we apply to actual quantification and verification. So our market program is set up to do that. And again, I think you will see much more migration of markets in the future to account for all of these outcomes from agriculture, given the demand, given the value. In terms of state of play, and then I'll wrap it up, just some high-level numbers. This shows in 2019 voluntary carbon markets. Europe and North America, clearly the bulk of demand and sales, accounting for about, 120, if you will, $1 million worth of demand, right? Remember, this is 2019. Interestingly, what we see is huge demand for forestry and land use credits, and the price of those going up and competing with others because of that charismatic nature, if you will, of credits from agriculture. So this reflects what we're seeing in terms of demand. The markets show forestry and land use and high demand, prices going up for that. This slide shows also the increase in both purchases from carbon offsets, and then the increase right here in the number of available offsets. This is 2020. This gap will start to really tighten due to increased demand that I pointed to, all of the reasons that there is increased demand. And I will wrap up with this. Where do we see growth projections? Karen referenced the Task Force on Voluntary Carbon Markets. They estimate the growth necessary to meet existing commitments, and there are new commitments coming on every day. So the growth necessary to meet existing commitments will increase 15-fold to at least $100 billion by 2030. McKinsey and Company puts that estimate at $50 billion. I think it's hard to say where that will end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Debbie. That was very good insight into all the markets. As you said, it's countries as well as corporations and cities in both the compliance and the voluntary market, and a lot of dollars there. This is not a linear progression of value, and it's almost exponential, the excitement out there now and the compliance. Okay, we'll go on to our next speaker now. Katie Sullivan is the Managing Director of IETA, which is the International Emissions Trading Association. It's a global multi-sector business voice for the intersection of markets and climate change. It informs market solutions to address environmental challenges across the Americas and globally. Katie also sits on the Global Steering Committee for the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, boards of the Climate Action Reserve, which is the California board, and the International Carbon Capture and Storage Knowledge Center, and numerous other advisory panels. I won't go on with the list there. So Katie is going to be speaking to us about making better policy structures and markets. So Katie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and Gottlieb, the World Congress on Conservation Agriculture, for having me here today and joining us morning, afternoon, evening. It's great to have an audience that's all over the world, and I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. Tom and I were saying earlier that this is kind of the dream team lineup when it comes to agriculture and certainly markets and policy. I think, Brian and certainly Karen and Debbie, they touched on a lot of items, so I won't have to drill down as much on some of the issues that I'd like to cover as we explore making better policy structures and markets for net zero while digging into the agriculture story. So just quickly with AIDA, it's helpful to know, AIDA has been around for over 20 years now. We came out of the UN process, have become the trusted global business voice on market solutions to tackle climate. And we help, around the world advance the goals of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement as informed by IPCC science. So we are working all over the world, subnational, national, regional, international level to create these markets to drive decarbonization, unlock private capital at scale. We have around, this is actually quite a dated slide. We've had a number of new members, even since the start of COVID last year. But we're around 170 members all around the world, and I think this is important to understand how we're truly multi-sector, where we have a lot of the emitters, a lot of the big oil and gas and power, manufacturing, cement, steel. We also represent a number of the banks and financial services, the investors, brokers, and traders. Certainly project developers across the gamut, including agriculture and forestry, but also CCUS and renewables and waste. And also the assurance providers, the verifiers, the validators, these key players that underpin this system, as I think Brian, Debbie, and Karen clearly communicated. We also represent a lot, not all, but a lot of the leading greenhouse gas standards. So CAR and Verra and ACR. I will say, actually, a lot of our new members, even last year and a half, a lot of them are project developers and investors in the natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions space, which again is not that surprising given where things are headed around both the demand side and supply on agriculture and forestry around carbon markets. I wanted to mention too, we do not pick favorites, let's say, in the world of technology types. We let the market decide, provided there's the right policy framework and the price signals at play. However, given the important role, climate benefit and co-benefit, and just that it will be a huge critical area of supply, AIDA actually launched a Markets for Natural Climate Solutions initiative at COP25 in Madrid, the UN negotiations in Madrid in 2019. And really the mission for this is about maximizing business investment, agriculture and forestry to ensure that they play the fullest possible role in delivering Paris Agreement. And the group is committed to really creating global carbon markets for NCS that are driven by compliance. So as was mentioned before, you can parse this space into the voluntary carbon market, the compliance carbon markets. We are really working closely with stakeholders and governments worldwide to drive these compliance obligations and demands for natural climate solutions. Also, while working to ensure fungibility of units and accounting certainty between these systems, as these carbon markets are linked, including across international borders, that there's fungibility, there's clarity, there's no double counting. Again, this is all with a view to helping to scale investments in these opportunities, including agriculture, and ensuring broad participation from all sorts of key stakeholders, including rural and farmers and growers. Again, obviously ensuring higher environmental integrity, the benefit to local communities, and ensuring transparency and foresight. And all I'll say is in 2021, 2022, there are some priority regions that we are working closely with around markets for NCS. Canada is one of them, Colombia, Mexico, South Africa, Singapore, UK, and now increasingly Australia. So there are targeted, work plans and engagement with these governments, other key stakeholders to really drive these compliance price signals and regimes for NCS. And I lost my button. All right, Tom, I know we don't have much time, so I'll just be whizzing through this. I think it's really important as we cover a lot of information that there are some key resources, market resources and data that have recently been published. And nearly everything on this slide has actually been published within the last 3 to 4 weeks. And it doesn't even capture everything. But I do encourage people to take a look at some of these key go-to resources related to carbon markets, on compliance and voluntary, to actually unpack what is occurring, including regionally. The World Bank Carbon Pricing Report 2021 is our go-to gospel on a lot of the carbon market designs, implementation, the status of that. And also ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, their new emissions trading and net zero that delves into the role of emissions trading and removals in reaching net zero targets by governments. The other thing that I'll a little plug for AIDA, but regionally, a lot of you are joining from different, states, provinces, countries worldwide. AIDA has recently updated our catalog of carbon markets, and we call them the business briefs because they're done so through an executive private sector lens. They're fairly quick reads, but there you can actually look at all of the design elements, including the protocols, all of the pricing, where prices have been, some of the forecasts, some of the supply-demand dynamics and participation. So if you want to take a look into Mexico or Colombia or China or Europe, I do encourage you to check out some of these updated briefs on AIDA's site. Looking at just Paris Agreement, rolling it back to 2015, I think it's critical to underscore how it's such a different world than Kyoto, right? With Kyoto, you had 37 countries around the world, legally binding targets, but then the rest of the world wasn't, covered by a reduction target. It wasn't moving forward with any, greenhouse gas, certainly carbon pricing activities. Whereas Paris, we're all in the same tent. It's kind of it's a messy tent, but you have 197 countries, including the U.S., back at the table that has put forward these nationally determined contributions, as Debbie mentioned. So they have these targets through 2030, that enhanced ambition. There's more and more coming through to November of this year, Glasgow negotiations, and increasingly you're seeing net zero legislation and commitments by these countries. So within the Paris Agreement, I would be remiss not to mention that the article that we hold near and dear to our hearts, Article 6, is the markets article. And even back in 2015, you had a number of countries, around 100 of them, that identified that they were planning to use international markets and trading to cooperate in order to reach their NDCs, or if they had access to these international markets and trading, they could enhance that level of ambition of their climate commitments. And so even back in, again, 2015, you already had a lot of desire to use these international carbon markets. And AIDA and the University of Maryland did, we decided, well, let's quantify the power of these markets. If you actually were to have clear guidance, Paris Agreement guidance around the use of these markets and proper accounting, no double counting, ensuring environmental integrity, just allowing money to flow to least cost options and therefore driving financing into borders, what would it look like around the cost savings? So we looked at all of the NDCs from 2015 and said if these countries were to go it alone, versus, so go it alone only within their borders, they did not use international markets and trading to reach their climate goal, versus if they were to allow for trading and fungibility, that you could unlock, including with land use opportunities, around $350 billion a year by 2030. So it's not insignificant, and it's a really important message to deliver. So around $350 billion in cost savings by 2030. If you were to then take that money and say, well, they were going to use that money anyway to reach their climate goal, you were to take that money and drive it into enhanced mitigation, then you could unlock an additional 8 to 9 gigatons, billion tons a year in additional greenhouse gas reductions. So That is, it helps to quantify it, and then you can package it to actually deliver the message that these markets, they matter. They matter for a host of reasons around cost savings and enhanced ambition. And I just have to emphasize this to the group because as we head into the COP26 in Glasgow in November, it will be important that all influencers and stakeholders can communicate to their government officials why we need clear guidance adopted on Article 6 at the negotiations, because we do not yet have it yet. And there's a lot of investor money, private sector capital that is laying in wait right now. It is not insignificant amount of money. This is significant capital that is ready to flow, but a lot of it is to also, they need to get sparked with the guidance from Article 6 at the negotiating table in Paris. And it's not just on compliance, for compliance purposes. There's a lot of confusion also around the voluntary carbon market as well, especially when there's credits that could be imported, exported across international borders. So thank you for allowing me to get into Article 6. I think it's important and it's timely with the group. Obviously, you've seen this map before, but what a lot of the Paris agreements, these commitments, these NDCs have done is they've triggered this bottom-up activity around carbon pricing over the last couple of years. So there is this recent surge of activity. And like Karen said, there's around 4 compliance carbon pricing systems. About half of those are pure carbon taxes, no trading element, no offsets element. The other half, there is some kind of carbon market emissions trading component, but it's cap and trade systems, it's intensity-based trading systems, output-based pricing system like Canada. You also, though, have Colombia and South Africa that have carbon taxes where you can use offsets as compliance obligations. And you will probably see more and more of that kind of model, especially in developing economies and some emerging economies. But then how do you stitch this fragmentation together so they're not in their islands? I won't get into, if we had more time, I'd get into some super highlights around key jurisdictions and where they are on net zero and emissions trading, but I'll save that for now. But this is just a little glimpse around all of these, countries, states, provinces have put forward their, they have either policy document, proposed legislation, or in-law net zero commitments. And all the rectangles, triangles are those that are using emissions trading systems, ETS. One thing that transcends all the emissions trading systems, even though they are different in maybe scope, coverage, and infrastructure, some even MRV, right? All of them use offsets. All of them use offsets on the compliance side. I will skip that. But what you are seeing is this convergence around the voluntary carbon market and the compliance carbon markets. So it was quite divorced, and it wasn't so long ago where it was quite divorced. There was the voluntary, Camplet, ERA, CARB, Vera, and then you had the compliance spaces with governments doing their own thing. Increasingly, you have governments around the world that are leaning heavily on voluntary carbon market standards, protocols, the infrastructure, and even just the science and approaches to permanence and additionality. They're leaning heavily on it to adapt to their compliance programs, or they're just fully adopting some of these things from the voluntary carbon market. And so that's important to understand how these two kind of divorced worlds previously are increasingly interconnecting and converging. This is what Karen had showcased. This is quite up to date. I mean, this is the World Bank report published a couple of weeks ago. It's very handy for anybody to look at, okay, which over the 20 offset programs in voluntary, international, and then over 20 domestic government-driven programs, what are the project types where there are currently protocols and methodologies that are in use to actually generate credits? And what in the last year, that's important, the issuances and the average prices that you can't really read here, but that is just from the last year, from April 2020 to April 2021. But you can see that agriculture, there's only 7 across the voluntary and the compliance. There's a lot more movement and desire to see more agriculture within these systems. The net zero, and this is where I'll wrap, Tom, in a moment. So the voluntary market driver, you can't emphasize it enough, how you have well over 1,000, corporates and investors taking on major net zero commitments. You have well over, I think, of the 2,000 largest public companies, over a quarter of them now have net zero commitments. That represents over $14 trillion in annual sales of these companies. So that is where the voluntary market was tiny in the past. A lot of the eyes, it was just purely on the compliance play. So it was tiny, hundreds of millions of dollars in total value, not hundreds of billions of dollars like in the compliance space, but it is moving, dramatically. And you have the volumes, the highest volumes will increasingly now be from forestry and land use. It will overtake renewable energies for a variety of reasons. Also, the value, it was even the highest back in 2017 through 2019. It will just increasingly become, at the higher end. And the prices from 2017 to 2019, they're so small compared to what we expect to see on agriculture, forestry going forward. And a lot of that for reasons Debbie already mentioned. So TSVCM, the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market. This was mentioned again by Debbie and Karen. AIDA has been deeply involved in this process since its launch in September 2020. And the whole purpose of the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market was to say, hey, this has been a pretty opaque voluntary carbon market that's all over-the-counter bilateral deals. We need more transparency in this market. We need more liquidity, more participation. We need integrity, and not just integrity on the supply side. We need integrity on the demand side as well. So what can we do to actually drive this transparency to get to this goal of actually increasing the voluntary carbon market 15 times by 2030? So this task force is in the throes of actually a consultation process. Well, it wrapped yesterday, but a few key takeaways here. They are very ambitious. They are moving fast. You will see an announcement by Mark Carney. I think it's in July 9th, where there will be a final report on the outcomes and piloting to help scale the voluntary carbon market. And this will cover a lot of items, including a possible new governance structure globally for the voluntary carbon market, providing oversight and development of core carbon principles. That will then define core carbon contracts and a taxonomy of attributes, some that Debbie had mentioned, that could be baked into these contracts and deals, looking at exchange traded core carbon reference contracts. So again, you can drive that more capital, more oversight and transparency in these markets. So I would just strongly encourage the community to just watch this space even over the coming weeks and what could be pumped out around the voluntary carbon market. And you and agriculture broadly could really, plug in and leverage as this market evolves into hopefully something that will be incredibly, prosperous and beneficial not only to climate, but also, communities and other groups worldwide. So I tried to buzz through, Tom. I know we're at the top of the hour, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katie. Very informative presentation, lots of material there. And I know that some of the listeners and watchers will have influence with their countries and going to the Glasgow meetings. And so you've stimulated them to go after their teams or their politicians that are going there and chase them on Article 6. So that's very good. Thank you. We are short of time, but I'll take a couple of questions here, and I just ask if you could answer them as briefly as you can. There's one here from Saidi Makoma in Africa, ACT. Debbie, thank you for the highly informative presentation. Could you explain further why banks should have a business interest or obligation to purchase carbon?
I'm not sure that's what I meant. I would say banks are interested in who they are actually financing and looking at the risk profiles of loans, for instance. If you think about banks in agriculture, they are increasingly looking at the resilience of those systems and their ability right, to survive a lot of the events that we're seeing. So in our country, and I think it's already true in Europe, there is increasing requirement to file your financial risk as a company that relates to how much exposure you as a company have to climate change, and specifically what you are doing to mitigate that exposure. And banks and others are increasingly looking at those profiles before, in fact, they are making lending decisions.
Okay, thank you. Got a couple of questions here for Brian. Put them together. Brian, this is from Miguel Rapulo. What is your opinion about the estimations made by carbon models? Which models do you consider more reliable? And while you're at it, Beth Sarhaft had asked, do you think SAR imagery can be used to estimate soil organic carbon stocks or changes, or only for one of the covariates you mentioned, i.e. the soil moisture?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Yeah. So in terms of models, it's really not so much that one model is necessarily better than the other, but is you have to be able to, demonstrate that they're validated for the conditions that you're applying them to. So it really isn't that one model is better. It's just which model meets all your practical needs and also can be shown to work very well in the kind of conditions and the application that you're going to apply it to. And then with regard to SAR, I see that more as a covariate because it isn't a direct measurement of soil organic carbon, but it could be something that can be used to help estimate soil organic carbon. Again, that has to be underpinned by some very high quality measurement at certain points where you make that relationship between SAR and other covariates and soil organic carbon.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just gotten a signal that we do have to wrap up, so I won't be able to get to the last questions, but you've definitely stimulated questions here, and people know where you're at and what you look like now, so you're not safe, and they can go after you for more questions after the fact. Thank you very much for providing your emails as well. Before we leave, I'd like to remind the audience to look at the Wonder Me in the lounge area, to register with that, to visit on these specific topics again of the whole Congress. So go to the lounge area and look for the Wonder Me registration. Also, an announcement that Syngenta has a Zoom webinar link in their booth 11 of the sponsors area. So you can go there. You may recall yesterday, the executive from Syngenta said, why don't we have, markets for ecosystem services or these bigger pictures on a global sense? And we've just seen some speakers talking about that here now. So with that, I'd like to thank Brian and Karen and Debbie and Katie again very much for your presentations. You've caused, I'm sure, more questions. I shouldn't say put any questions to bed, but maybe some of those, but it's been very helpful because everybody's been asking about this issue of markets, and your experience in the area is very evident from your presentation. So thank you very much, and I turn it back to production to play the elevator music. Thank you.